January 26, 1945, 2:30 p.m., near the village of Holtzwihr, Alsace region, northeastern France. Winter pressed down on the battlefield with deep snow, frozen mud, and a heavy silence broken only by the distant thunder of artillery. The Battle of the Bulge had not fully ended, and the German army, even while retreating, continued to launch aggressive and desperate counterattacks against thinly held American positions. Before we go further, leave a comment saying where you are watching from and what most strikes you about real stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and join the discussion, because what happened on this frozen field defies common ideas about human endurance and courage. That afternoon, Company B of the 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division of the United States Army, held a fragile defensive line along the edge of a forest. The soldiers were exhausted, feet numb from the cold, uniforms soaked, ammunition running low. Many of them were young men who had never faced a full-scale enemy assault. What they did not know was that an entire German infantry company was advancing toward them, composed of experienced troops supported by automatic weapons. At the center of that line stood 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy. He was 20 years old, barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, thin, with a face hardened by fatigue. A week earlier, he had been wounded in the leg, but he had refused evacuation. The pain was constant and sharp, yet the thought of leaving his men behind weighed heavier than the injury. He moved slowly between positions, shouting short commands, adjusting fields of fire, trying to hold the line together. At 2:45 p.m., the first shells struck. German artillery began falling with terrifying accuracy. Shrapnel sliced through the air. Trees exploded into splinters. Snow was thrown upward mixed with dark earth. The sound did not come in waves. It was continuous and crushing, making the ground tremble beneath the soldiers' bodies. Within minutes, it was clear this was not a probing attack. It was a full assault. Through the smoke, Murphy saw enemy figures emerging from the trees, men advancing in open formation, shouting orders in German, firing rifles and machine guns as they moved. The American line began to buckle. One platoon fell back in disorder. Another lost its leader. The danger of encirclement became immediate and real. To the left of the American position, an M10 tank destroyer had been hit moments earlier. The vehicle burned steadily, flames pouring from the engine compartment, thick black smoke rising into the gray sky. The crew had already abandoned it. It should have been nothing more than a wreck on the battlefield, but to Murphy, it became the only remaining option. At 2:52 p.m., realizing the line would not hold much longer, Murphy made a decisive choice. He ordered his men to withdraw toward the edge of the forest and establish a new defensive position. He did not ask for volunteers. He did not explain what he intended to do. He simply shouted for them to fall back and regroup. Dragging his wounded leg through the snow, Audie Murphy moved toward the burning M10. Every step defied instinct. Bullets cracked through the air around him, striking the hot metal of the vehicle. The heat was intense, and the smell of burning fuel mixed with gunpowder. He climbed onto the hull of the tank destroyer, feeling the metal burn even through his gloves. Mounted on top was a .50 caliber machine gun, still operational. Murphy positioned himself there, completely exposed, elevated above the field, visible to every German soldier advancing across the open ground. At 2:55 p.m., he opened fire. The roar of the .50 caliber tore through the air like a continuous thunderclap. Each burst shredded trees, kicked up columns of snow, and dropped enemy soldiers who had been advancing seconds earlier. The Germans hesitated. They had not expected resistance at that point. They could not imagine that a single man was manning that weapon. Murphy alternated machine gun fire with radio transmissions, directing American artillery onto his own position. He calmly reported enemy movements and distances as tracer rounds lit the smoke-filled air. Shrapnel ripped at his uniform. The fire on the tank crept closer to stored ammunition. The Germans responded quickly. Enemy machine guns concentrated their fire on the M10. Bullets slammed into the hull again and again, sparks flying as the metal rang under the impacts. Still, Murphy kept firing, jaw clenched, eyes burning from smoke and cold. At 3:10 p.m., German infantry attempted to flank the position, moving along the side of the field. Murphy slowly shifted the weapon, ignoring the searing pain in his leg, and swept the area with short, controlled bursts. Bodies fell. The advance stopped. Time began to stretch. each second feeling unnaturally long. And there, alone atop a burning tank, surrounded by enemy forces, Audie Murphy continued to fight as the minutes passed, and his ammunition steadily ran down. The clock moved slowly toward 3:20 p.m. Flames continued to consume the M10 tank destroyer beneath Audie Murphy's feet, and the heat warped the air around him. The metal deck was now painfully hot, burning through his boots, but he did not shift his position. The .50 caliber machine gun kept hammering, each burst deliberate, each pause measured to conserve what little ammunition remained. Across the open field, the German advance had stalled. Officers shouted commands, trying to restore momentum under fire they could not clearly understand. From their perspective, this was not the resistance of a lone soldier, but the fire of a reinforced defensive position that refused to collapse. At 3:25 p.m., another German element emerged from the forest line, moving low and using trees and shallow depressions for cover. Murphy spotted the movement immediately. He waited, tracking their progress through the sights, letting them draw closer. When he fired, the burst cut through branches, bark, and bodies alike. The attack dissolved almost instantly. Between bursts, Murphy continued speaking into the radio. His voice remained steady as he relayed enemy positions and movement. American artillery answered. Shells began to land among the German formations, exploding with sharp, violent cracks that threw snow and earth high into the air. Each impact forced the attackers to scatter, breaking their coordination and slowing their advance even further. Enemy fire intensified in response. German machine guns raked the burning tank relentlessly. Bullets struck the hull in rapid succession, sparks spraying outward, the steel ringing like a bell under constant blows. Fragments of hot metal tore through Murphy's jacket and gloves, cutting his skin. He stayed where he was, adjusting his aim, refusing to give ground. At 3:35 p.m., a mortar round detonated close to the M10. The blast rocked the vehicle, and Murphy nearly lost his balance. For a brief moment, the world collapsed into noise and smoke. When his vision cleared, he was still standing. Without hesitation, he resumed firing, his actions driven more by instinct than conscious thought. The wound in his leg worsened with every movement. Blood soaked into the snow-covered surface of the tank. Pain surged upward with each shift of weight, but Murphy ignored it completely. He understood that stopping, even for seconds, would give the Germans the opening they needed. At 3:40 p.m., the enemy attempted a new approach. A group of soldiers crawled along a shallow ditch, hoping to move outside the machine gun's direct field of fire. Murphy noticed the unnatural movement in the snow. He adjusted the elevation and fired downward, forcing them to scatter and abandon the maneuver before they reached effective range. Behind him in the forest, American soldiers watched in disbelief. They knew Murphy was alone. They knew he was wounded. Yet the relentless fire from that single position bought them precious time. They reorganized their defense, redistributed ammunition, and tended to the wounded minute by minute, while the enemy remained pinned down in the open. By 3:45 p.m., the smoke from the burning tank had grown thicker, darker. Flames crept dangerously close to the vehicle's ammunition storage. The risk of explosion was obvious. Murphy was fully aware of it. Still, he did not climb down. He kept firing, maintaining pressure, denying the enemy any chance to regroup. The German attacks began to lose cohesion. Advances turned hesitant. Small groups moved forward only to fall back again under immediate fire. What had begun as a coordinated assault now showed signs of exhaustion and confusion, but the engagement was far from over. At 3:50 p.m., Murphy felt the rhythm of the machine gun change. The ammunition belt was nearly exhausted. Each burst now carried greater weight. He counted the seconds between firing, stretching time as much as possible, knowing the final moments were approaching. Under the gray Alsatian sky, standing on a burning tank with enemy soldiers still in front of him, Audie Murphy sensed that the next few minutes would determine whether his stand had been enough to change the fate of everyone behind him. The minute hand crept toward 3:55 p.m. The burning M10 groaned beneath the heat and repeated impacts, its steel plates popping as the fire intensified. Audie Murphy could feel the vibration of the machine gun through his arms and chest with every burst. The ammunition belt was now visibly short, each link sliding into the feed tray with a sense of finality. Across the field, the German infantry regrouped once more. Officers waved their arms, shouting orders, trying to push their men forward despite the mounting losses. Smoke and drifting snow reduced visibility, turning the battlefield into a blurred, shifting landscape. Murphy leaned into the weapon, scanning for movement, forcing his mind to remain focused as his body screamed for rest. At 3:56 p.m., a cluster of German soldiers broke from cover, running hard toward the American positions. Murphy waited until they were fully exposed, then he fired. The machine gun thundered again, cutting them down in seconds. Survivors dropped flat or retreated, dragging wounded comrades behind them. Almost immediately, return fire intensified. Bullets cracked past Murphy's head, some striking the gun mount itself. One round smashed into the metal shield near his face, showering him with fragments. His ears rang, but his grip never loosened. He adjusted his stance and kept firing, refusing to surrender the high ground he had claimed. The radio beside him crackled. Murphy continued calling in artillery, calmly correcting coordinates as shells landed closer and closer to his own position. Explosions tore through the German ranks, breaking any remaining momentum. The enemy attack, once confident and organized, now felt hesitant, fragmented, unsure. By 3:58 p.m., the heat had become unbearable. Flames licked dangerously close to the machine gun mount. Smoke burned his lungs, forcing shallow breaths. His vision blurred at the edges, but the center of his focus remained locked on the field ahead. Then, suddenly, the machine gun fell silent. The ammunition was gone. For a split second, the battlefield seemed to pause. Murphy released the trigger and looked down at the empty feed tray. He was still standing on a burning tank, wounded, exposed, and now unarmed. The Germans noticed almost immediately. Shouts rose across the field as enemy soldiers realized the fire had stopped. Murphy did not hesitate. At approximately 4 p.m., he climbed down from the M10, sliding off the burning hull despite the pain in his leg. As his boots hit the snow, he drew his rifle and began moving back toward the forest. German fire followed him, bullets snapping through the air, kicking up snow at his feet. He reached the American line just as the Germans attempted to renew their advance. Without pause, Murphy took command. He positioned his men, issued rapid orders, and opened fire with his rifle. Inspired by what they had just witnessed, the American soldiers surged forward with renewed determination. The counterattack began almost immediately. Supported by artillery and small arms fire, the Americans advanced, pushing the exhausted German troops back across the field they had struggled to cross for over an hour. What had been moments earlier, a desperate defensive stand, now turned into a forward movement. German resistance began to collapse. Units that had already suffered heavy casualties broke and withdrew toward the forest line. Others fell back in disorder, leaving equipment and wounded behind. The momentum had shifted completely. By 4:10 p.m., the field near Holtzwihr was once again in American hands. The German assault had failed. Only then did the full toll on Audie Murphy become visible. He collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. Medics rushed to him, finally forcing him to accept treatment. His uniform was torn, blackened by smoke, his face streaked with soot and sweat. What he had done in those 60 minutes was only beginning to be understood. As the smoke cleared and the firing faded, the men around him looked at the burned-out tank and the empty field beyond, realizing that the outcome of the battle there had hinged on a single decision, made under fire by one man who refused to step back. The immediate fighting around Holtzwihr faded into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the crackle of burning wreckage. Snow continued to fall lightly, settling over shell craters, discarded equipment, and the bodies left behind on the frozen ground. For the men of Company B, the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in only after the adrenaline drained away. Audie Murphy was carried to a sheltered position near the forest edge. Medics worked quickly, cutting away his damaged uniform, cleaning the wound in his leg, and treating burns and shrapnel cuts across his body. He drifted in and out of awareness, the sounds of battle echoing faintly in his ears. He did not ask about medals or recognition. His first question, once he could speak, was whether his men had held the line. The German withdrawal became more evident as reports filtered in from neighboring units. The enemy assault in this sector had collapsed entirely. What had been intended as a coordinated push to exploit weakened American defenses had instead resulted in heavy German casualties and a complete loss of momentum. The delay inflicted during that single hour proved decisive. As officers assessed the battlefield, the significance of Murphy's actions became clear. He had not only stopped an advancing enemy company, but had done so alone, wounded, and exposed. using a burning tank destroyer as a firing platform. His continuous fire and precise artillery coordination had created the illusion of a far stronger defensive force than actually existed. Throughout the late afternoon, American units consolidated their positions, ammunition was redistributed, fields of fire were reinforced, and wounded soldiers were evacuated. German forces made no further attempts to retake the ground. The line held firm through the night. As darkness approached, the battlefield took on a grim stillness. Fires burned low, casting flickering light across the snow. The M10 tank destroyer that Murphy had climbed earlier stood blackened and twisted, its ammunition finally having burned out without detonating. It remained as silent evidence of how close the situation had come to disaster. Word of the stand at Holtzwihr spread quickly through the regiment. Soldiers spoke in low voices about the young officer who had stood alone against an entire company. Some had watched him from the forest, convinced they were seeing a man sacrifice himself so they could survive. Others had only heard the relentless thunder of the machine gun and wondered how such fire could come from a single position. By the following day, formal reports were being written. Timelines were reconstructed. Witness statements were collected. The account was difficult to believe even to those who had lived it. 60 minutes of continuous resistance, under direct fire, while wounded, and atop a burning vehicle, defied conventional understanding of battlefield endurance. Yet the facts aligned. The enemy advance had been halted. The American line had held. The casualties and captured equipment confirmed the intensity of the engagement. There was no exaggeration needed. What had happened spoke for itself. For Murphy, the experience left no visible pride. When officers later spoke to him, he downplayed his role, insisting that any man in his position would have done the same. His focus remained on his unit and on the ongoing fight. The war was not over, and there would be no time to dwell on a single moment, no matter how extraordinary. As the winter campaign continued, the stand at Holtzwihr became one of those rare events that quietly altered the course of local operations without ever appearing on grand maps or strategic overview. A small field, a burned-out tank, and an hour of resistance had reshaped the outcome of an entire sector. And still, the full weight of what Audie Murphy had done, and what it would come to represent, had yet to be fully realized. In the days that followed the fight near Holtzwihr, January tightened its grip on the Alsatian front. Temperatures dropped further, and the snow hardened into ice. The front lines stabilized, and the German offensive in the region lost what little strength it still possessed. The stand made in that open field was no longer an isolated incident. It had become a turning point for the sector. Audie Murphy was evacuated to a rear medical station once his condition allowed. Surgeons treated his leg wound properly for the first time, removed shrapnel, and dressed burns sustained while standing on the burning tank destroyer. Only then did the physical cost of that hour fully emerge. He had fought not only the enemy, but shock, blood loss, extreme cold, and exhaustion, all at once. Official reports moved up the chain of command. Testimonies from soldiers, radio logs, artillery records, and battlefield assessments confirmed what initially sounded impossible. One officer, wounded and alone, had delayed and broken the advance of an entire German company for nearly 60 minutes, preventing a breakthrough that could have collapsed the American line in that area. Weeks later, the decision was made. Audie Murphy would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States. The citation described his actions with careful, restrained language, yet even those formal words struggled to capture the reality of what had happened atop that burning M10. When the medal was presented, Murphy stood quietly, uncomfortable with the attention. He did not speak of heroism. He did not describe fear or bravery. He spoke only of duty, of holding the line because there was no other choice. To him, the field near Holtzwihr was not a legend, but a moment where survival depended on refusing to give ground. For the men who had watched from the forest, the memory never faded. They remembered the sound of the machine gun, constant and defiant. They remembered how time itself seemed to pause while one man held back an entire force. Many later said that seeing Murphy on that tank changed how they understood courage, not as the absence of fear, but as action taken despite it. The burned-out M10 was eventually removed, the battlefield reclaimed by time and weather. Snow melted, grass returned, and the scars of combat slowly softened. Yet the events of January 26, 1945, remained fixed in history, marked by exact times, exact locations, and verified actions. Audie Murphy would survive the war and return home as the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War. But long after the medals were awarded and the headlines faded, that hour in Alsace continued to define him more than any ceremony ever could. Not because it made him famous, but because it revealed what a single individual could do when everything else was falling apart. On a frozen afternoon, in an open field near Holtzwihr, one wounded man climbed onto a burning tank and refused to retreat. And in doing so, he changed the fate of everyone behind him.